Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Keep the Line Moving, the podcast designed to talk about leadership, life, and inspiration. I am your host, Chris Gargano. This is episode 95. And before we get to the conversation with our tremendous guests, let us say we are strategizing for year 3 of the podcast. Do you subscribe to the podcast? If not, why? If so, thank you. Do you recommend it? Same question. If not, why? If so, continue to recommend it. We are so grateful for that. Give us reviews. Let us know the type of guest that you would like to hear from, the topic of conversation in the future that you would like to hear. We will address that. This is a podcast that was cultivated in service to you, helping you be a better leader, a better employee, coworker, teammate, coach, whatever the case may be. That's why we're doing this. So feedback would be greatly appreciated as we strategize for year 3. All right, to our guest, Brandon Brown, Dr. Brandon Brown. He spent 8 years as a professor at NYU before recently taking a job as the director of TIDES, lecturer, University Central Florida Sport Business Management Program. He's also president, Sport Marketing Association. He is a busy person. He will analyze his day-to-day for us. He will share his philosophy, how he approaches his teaching with his students, as well as the consulting work he's done for the NFL, the Brooklyn Nets, NYCFC, Fox Sports, and his love of the New York Mets. So much to talk about. Here we go with Dr. Brandon Brown. All right, everybody. Brandon Brown is with us. Dr. Brandon Brown. Yes, he is an educator. Wait till you hear this story on this gentleman. And not only that, when I started teaching at NYU back in February of 18, this gentleman made me feel welcome. First of all, welcome. It's great to see you.
Thank you, man, and thank you for having me.
You're in a wonderful new position, but let's create the foundation. And tell us about, your growing up and how you determined that education was a great path. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you also have other passions. But let's start at the beginning, Brandon. Growing up, where you're from, and tell us your story, please, because I think fans and people that listen to this podcast would really appreciate it.
I appreciate the question, man. So growing up, so it's weird having like an educational perspective on what I'm about to say, because I'm a sport management major. As a student, I'm a sport management professor, and we're always kind of telling our students, well, here's what you say and here's what you don't say. And I guess you're kind of taught to tell the students, hey, don't say I love sports and that's why I want to get into the industry, which is funny because that's why I got into it, right? Like I just loved sports. I guess I had a family full of sports people. A low key spill some tea that I got a Mets tattoo. I have 3 other cousins who have Mets tattoos, and I have 4 other cousins who have Yankees tattoos. So it's not just like, oh, my family likes sports. Like my family's very passionate about sports. It's part of our culture. I'm half Black, half Italian, so on both sides as well. So I guess it was just pretty simple. And I guess I can't say that like I had this like deep thought process in terms of what I wanted to originally study. It was just sport management was available. I looked into it a tiny bit, to be honest. And I said, okay, I didn't know that could be a profession. Now that I'm an old man, I can say that it was somewhat new, sport management. But when I found about the possibilities of it, it was something that I went to. And I'm originally from New York. I grew up in Florida. Some of the Florida schools were available to me, but then Florida State seemed to be the right one. Studied sport management. Did an internship, did a few internships there, but did an internship particularly with an indoor football team called the Tallahassee Titans. We were one and done. I eventually went to UCF at the DeVos Sport Business Management Program. And I learned a ton in terms of sport, but I also learned a ton in terms of leadership and kind of rounding out who I am as a person. And I think it was then that I kind of got a grasp of who I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And I think a lot of it was just about following your passion and kind of getting an insight of who you are and what you like. And it led to teaching. And I eventually said to my professors at the time, Dr. Lapchick and Dr. Bill Sutton, I said, I want to teach, and this is what I want to do for a number of reasons I'm sure we'll get into later. And they said, yeah, sure. Just take some time, make sure it is what you want to do, maybe go into the industry. And so I did. I went into the industry. I worked for a couple of years I worked with the New York Mets for some time. I managed a gym for a little bit. And then eventually I came back and I said, you know what, I still have the same passion. So I decided to do my PhD, Texas A&M University. So did my PhD, taught at the University of Tampa after that for a little bit. And then I was on to NYU. I spent the last 8 years prior to this one at NYU, not only teaching sport management again, but also because it's New York, you're often involved with any number of sport entities. So I used my research background to kind of get myself into the door of a number of industry members. And I've been consulting for the past 8 or so years as well, working with the NFL, Brooklyn Nets, Fox Sports, and I still have a great relationship, NYCFC. So I've utilized my research background to kind of stay in touch with industry, but at the same time, I'm doing what I love, which is teaching. I love, love, love teaching. And that's kind of my main bread and butter.
Brandon, that's what this podcast is about. It's listening to the stories of individuals, right? And here's where I want to go with this. These tattoos with the family. Okay, not just the tattoos, but the tattoos are symbolic of your familia commitment, right, to sport. What was it, Brandon, that united you and your family members? Paint that picture for us. What was it about sport that brought you together?
Yeah, I think it's, and it's funny, I teach a course called The Science of Fandom, or I have in the past. And so fandom's like up my alley. And I'm often talking about this very thing that just sport in and of itself is a representation of culture, is a representation of family. And so to me, it was always like that commonality, that common point. And especially, you know, as I mentioned, I'm originally from New York, but I grew up in Florida. And the only time I would get back to New York, we would often get back to New York, and we still do. Christmases, all my Christmases were up in New York. And then a lot of my summers were over in New York. And it was just that sport was kind of that common point. And it was never far from one's own mindset, right? Like if I still talk to my uncles this day, the very first or second thing that they will mention will be the Yankees or something like that. So it's just kind of that common touch point that kind of speaks across borders, so to speak. And it, to me, once again, I found out that it could be something that you could get into. And I said, okay, well, let's do this. But that was it, you know, just this idea that it could be this common denominator. And it was the thing that kind of kept me and a lot of my relatives together throughout the years, knowing that we could always just kind of chat throughout about particular sports or about particular athletes, whatever it is, before text was around, emails going back and forth. Yeah, so any number of topics, and that was just that common language, so to speak.
Okay, Brandon. So you start your educational journey, right? And you're first at Florida State, as you said, and then you progress onto your MBA, your doctorate. Geez, you've just kept going. You just kept going with that education. But as an incoming freshman at Florida State, what were you like? And then what did you become as part of that educational journey? Because we all, right, remember going into school, my goodness, the difference between myself as a freshman in college and then as a grad student is just monumental. I'm sure it was the same for you.
Yeah, you know what? So I'll be as frank as possible. And I love doing it, right? Like, I think my friends, my high school buddies say to me, like, do your students know the person who you were? Which is trying to say that I was a little crazy, right? Like, and I don't want to get into the things, what I have in my background, but I was, you know, coming into Florida State as a freshman, as a first-year student, you know, I definitely couldn't think of the current position that I'm in. And I bring that up for a multitude of reasons, right? Like, I'll say that you can change several times over. I'll say that you can mature quickly. I'll say that you can mature slowly at times, and also that you don't know what your path is going to be. And I'm turning 40 next year, God bless, which means that, like, I still have 40 more years. So especially when you're a first year, God bless, I got 40, maybe 50 or 60 more years, Chris. But when you're a first year student in college, I think it's to say that, like, you can change several times over, and you have a ton of time to change. So yeah, that was my first year at Florida State. I was a rambunctious kid going to Florida State. It was known as like a top 10 party school at the time. Partying away, little by little, starting to gain traction in the educational realm, but not there yet, man. My first year, I got to be honest, man, I wasn't there yet. It was just kind of enjoying the college scene, and eventually I started to grasp onto the education world.
How refreshing that story you just told is. because it just allows us, listen, we evolve as people. I was immature when I was 18. And that's what you're saying, right? There's an immaturity, there's an evolution, there's learning, there's growing, and we're different people in different stages of our lives. I applaud you for saying that. Okay. So your educational journey gets you to a PhD and then launches you into, and you said something in your previous answer that you had a passion for teaching and you started to share that with professors. What were those conversations like?
Yeah, so I had a passion for teaching, and it was more so maybe I can talk about kind of like what led to that passion. Um,
Absolutely. Yes.
I, I'm in a cool scenario where I always like to say that I can live vicariously through my students because they go off into whatever it is, and I say, keep me in touch. But I also am talking to my students about how you know you've picked the right direction. And not saying that I have like the end all answer. I always say it like there's a couple of things. Number one is how you introduce yourself. I always tell my students, picture yourself introducing yourself as, hey, I'm Chris, I blank, right? And if that kind of tickles the innards, that's probably it, right? And I think that that was my case with education. Like there was something about like not understanding it until I realized like, oh, I can see myself as a professor, and something about that, seeing myself as a professor, saying, you know what, or seeing myself saying to myself, hey, I'm a professor, something about that tickled my innards, so to speak. And I was like, this is it, right? And I think from there on out, it was only a matter of time of how you get to that destination. But I think it's easier to get to that destination if you have a true passion for it. And I think you can only find that true passion if you're doing like a true examination. And for me, that's what it was about, like a lot of self-examination. In particular with education, it was like, you know what? I've always been a college person. I've now gone to like at the time 2 different colleges. I love the lifestyle. I love presenting. I love talking in front of others. I need that type of energy interacting between people. I love semesters. I love college campuses. So one way or the other, it all kind of like came to a crescendo and said, you know what? This is it for you. And then I self-examined to a point where realizing that it was it for me. And I said, okay, now that I have that destination, it's not only easier to find it, not only easier to go to it, but I can go to it with that much more energy and kind of passion.
You know, that's so well put. And I agree with you. I love the whole thing about, I love semesters and college campus. My son is a senior in high school and we're taking him to visit schools around the East Coast and West Coast. And my wife keeps teasing me, you're more excited than he is. You got to relax a little bit, and because I agree with you. It's a wonderful atmosphere. It's not for everybody, but it's for us.
Yeah, so I mean, like, yeah, that's for us, right? Like, we
Yeah.
love college campuses, we love semesters. Like, if you're like, I can't get enough of my dog, and I love playing with my dog, but I also love drinking beer. Like, go open up a dog bar. By the way, like that's your passion. Cool, that's it. And I have a story about dog bars, by the way, Chris. I'll tell you about that maybe a little later on. But go open up a dog bar, right? If you're like, I love music, I love music, I love. There's so many schools for anything you want to do out there. If you love music, go find a school that's going to teach you how to produce music, right? Anything that you love is out there. You just have to do like a certain sense of like introspection to see what it is you particularly love that's going to tickle your innards. And then once you have that in mind, you go after it. It doesn't have to be college campuses.
Absolutely. Okay, so you've mentioned a couple of times your fandom with the New York Mets and the fact that you worked with the Mets. Take us to that, Brandon Brown, and what was it like working the couple years? Tell us about the job and how that impacted you for the rest of your career, per se.
So I'll talk a little bit first about choosing the Mets. I think that's an interesting story because I had an offer or two from other places. I think it was almost down to the Diamondbacks, and it was the Diamondbacks or the Mets. And I actually had to take this like blind leap of faith. I actually turned down the Diamondbacks before I heard from the Mets. And it was about, for me, following passion with the Mets. And so I arrived with the Mets. I was in this kind of sales program, so to speak, where everyone was at least guaranteed like 6 months worth of time. And then after that, depending on your results and what you did, then you could either move on and stay full time or, hey, you're let loose. It was interesting. I think one of the things that shocked me was how close knit and how small, I guess, the organization is. And I don't mean obviously brand reach or anything like that. I mean that, like, I think the majority of teams out there are like pretty close knit, right? Like it's not like, wow, there's like thousands of people here and I don't know anybody, right? Like you're interacting with a great number of people who you're continually going to interact with one way or the other, and you're going to know them pretty well. It's a kind of a small organization. So I was taken aback by that. But because of that, I kind of used it to kind of build up some relationships. Again, going back to these soft factors in terms of people, me being a people person. So at the end of the whole 6-month process, it was a sales program. And usually they'll take like the top salesperson. And I wasn't even close. I was like middle of the way. But they called me in and they said, listen, everybody talks about who you are. And you also have this unique stat where you've made the most calls of anybody. You may not have the best sales numbers, but you've made the most calls. And everybody really enjoys having you around. And so they kept me on in sales and in operations for the remainder of my time there. And I was fortunate enough to be hired as a full-time employee.
Did you enjoy the experience?
Loved it, man. Loved it. And I know that a lot of people will possibly say, don't work for your favorite team. It wasn't like that with me for a couple of reasons. I left on a really high note. And I don't know if that's the case for anybody, but I left on a really high note. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that I left because I wanted to do the PhD, right? I was at that point where I said, you know what? I like the education. That is still what I want to do. And so I announced to like my bosses, and I was like a little hesitant to say, I'm going to leave and I'm going to do my PhD. But it was the exact opposite of what I expected. People were like, awesome, man, this is great. And in fact, what it did is that they knew I was leaving and they knew I wasn't going to a rival or anything like that. So they actually like took me by the hand and allowed me to do a great number of other things. I had a good group of people who were above me that said, you know what, you're leaving. Let's have you learn as much as possible before you leave. And I think that's a testament to the Mets and the people who were above me at the time.
And you alluded to great leadership, right? That you were being led well. They gave you the freedom to do other things within the organization. Is it safe to say, and obviously I've read about you, I know you, is it safe to say is great leadership, is that what attracted you to your current role at the University of Central Florida, right? That you wanted to go back to where you started, well, in part of your journey, because you started at Florida State, but as part of your journey, tell us about your current job and what attracted you to leave New York and go down to Florida.
Yeah, I think it's a great point about kind of bringing it back into leadership, because at the time when I was at University of Central Florida, they're a very different program, and I'll call them they as if I weren't in this position. They're a very different program. We only have a master's, but within that master's, it takes only a certain amount of students per year. And because of that, it allows you to be a really close-knit community amongst your fellow classmates. And so therefore, the teachers, the professors who are in charge and the things that they're doing kind of really resonate with you because you have that familial buy-in. So I think the leadership by the professors that's set up to say, hey, we're a family here. Let's get you involved. Let's have you as interactive as possible. I think that sets up for a good environment, to the point where I left it all those many years ago and I was still interested in the program. And I think if you talk to a lot of our alums, they will say the same exact thing, that they still have such an affinity for University of Central Florida and our program. And so that's when this job came open, it was very much, I don't want to say like a slam dunk easy choice, but it was definitely something that immediately got my attention and said, you know what, if UCF is calling, I better at least try to make the call myself.
So how has it been? Director of Tides, lecturer, UCSF, Sport Business Management Program, President, Sports Marketing Association. There's a lot there. What is it? And you just broke down the overarching goal of the department, but what does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, so let me break it down because it's complicated. So Tides I'm the director of Tides. And actually, when I was a student, I was a graduate assistant helping out with Tides. Tides is the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport. And Tides puts out the Racial and Gender Report Card that's been going on for, I think, 25 to 30 years now. Dr. Lapchick is someone who started it. And it's basically, I guess, a survey of the workforce of the major leagues. Some do these reports and have them put out publicly, and some are actually privately. And they basically want a report of how they're doing with their hiring practices in terms of racial and gender makeup, some veterans and disabilities, those with disabilities. And so we give them these reports to say, hey, here's how you're doing. And we've just been fortunate enough, and I say we, even though I wasn't involved 20 years ago, that the media loves it. They find out what's going on. And I think it's a starting point to say, hey, here's possibly where you need to improve. Here's where you're doing great. I think in both instances, it serves as a great recruiting tool for any of the leagues. And I think you can speak with all the leagues now that they've used this report card as a positive means to grow their own companies. And that's exactly what it is. And I'm sure some of your listeners or you yourself has, Chris, it's not just some things that like, oh, we're doing some small report over here at UCF. It's that thing that runs across the ticker on ESPN when it drops, right? It's that thing that PTI will talk about when this report comes out. So I was a GA for that back when I was a student. And while I was at NYU, let me just mention this, I had done a number of studies on just consumer behavior. That's what my research was about. And I dropped a couple of studies basically talking about minority sport consumption. And I put out this paper called The Black Market, which is about African-American consumers. And it got a big hit, right? I think it got picked up by a number of outlets, and the NFL came calling and said, what can we do with this data? Help us with some things. And so I was able to consult with the NFL because of that. But as it relates to this current position, I think it was a really good transition that I've been doing some work that involves marketing in general, that involves sport management in general, but also this concept of not leaving behind the minority consumers or those who aren't exactly on the same page as everybody else. So I thought this job was almost kind of like the perfect position where I can still be a professor, but also help out with Tides, their report cards. And it's not out yet, but Tides, we're looking to do a ton of other things that will involve the leagues and other consumer reports, et cetera.
So you're doing research still, right? And you're helping fuel the studies and the surveys, and then you're also teaching. So you're getting perspectives in all different areas and your background in marketing. So it would appear to be a perfect fit for you. And you were a graduate assistant many years ago. How fulfilling is this for you? You know, and using a term that you used earlier, like tickling your insides. I mean, my goodness, going to work every day, you must have a smile, a gigantic smile.
It's awesome, man. I'm super blessed. I'll say that over and over, man. I'm blessed. It's such a cool job because I have a lot of friends. When you do your PhD, you become friends with just tons of professors. I'll have cousins going to colleges and stuff like that. I'm like, oh, I know a professor over there. I know a professor over there. So I have a ton of friends who are professors, a ton of colleagues who've gone elsewhere who are professors. Usually when you're a professor, you're staying within your own, professorship, and you're within your own university. With this Tides thing, man, we have so much connection to industry. Next week, we're taking a class trip to New York. We do like a trip every year. But on my behalf for Tides, I'm meeting with every single league to go over the report card, to go over what Tides has been doing with them because I'm new. And that speaks to the idea that, like, as a professor, that's extremely unique. And I can't say that I can't talk about how much of a blessing it is, man, to be not just a professor, but to have still a role within industry where I'm meeting with the NFL, I'm meeting with Major League Baseball, meeting with the WNBA, I'm meeting with the NBA. It's very cool to say that I'm not just a professor, but someone who's actively involved with the industry. And I again, just couldn't say, I can't say enough about how much of a great position it is.
So they're coming at you with great questions, I would assume, like open-minded approaches to how can we be better? How can we represent all the communities that make up our fan base, all the communities that make up potential hires, as you said, gender, race, other areas that we could be better. My assumption is, and based on what you're saying now, that those conversations are healthy and frequent. Fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say this about the racial and gender report card. Sometimes it's looked at as wow, you're talking about what this league didn't do, and you're pointing out their flaws or anything like that. I don't think it should be like that at all. In fact, it's exactly what it is. It's a report on certain hirings. So you get to say, well, here's where we are. And we're obviously looking to increase what we're doing in terms of more inclusivity. And, I think the report card in and of itself speaks to, I think at the very beginning mentions of it, speaks to the idea that like a more diverse workforce equals a more profitable workforce, equals a culture that's better for employees. I think that's been proven through a number of different research methods. So yeah, I don't want, or I guess I'm meeting with these leagues to make sure it's established that we're doing this for the sake of the leagues, so it can be perceived by the public and by the leagues as something that's going to be helpful. It's something that's going to be a tool for each organization going forward. And I think we're trying to take on a number of different initiatives as well, whether it be like different research reports or just different forums where we can come together and have open discussions and whatnot.
That's great. Creating discussions. Brandon, that's just tremendous. And that's, I applaud you for the work, the new position. Congratulations. All right, Brandon, we have a few minutes here, and I have custom made all-star moments for you. Your teaching philosophy is what?
Co-constructivism, which means I'm helping, or the students are helping me construct the classroom. I never want to just be talking at students. I want them to make the classroom.
Connecting with students. How do you do it?
Emotion, engagement. I think you have to be likable. I think you have to bring up emotion in students. And once that emotion's up, I think brains open up, perspectives open up, understanding opens up. So be a likable person. That might be harder for some people, but try your best to be likable more so than being like a tough professor. Be a relatable individual before you are a teaching professor.
Next one, putting you on the spot. You can handle it. In sports, who markets well?
Shaq. He's great, man. I mean, he's stayed relevant for however many years, and he's great, man. He's beloved by everybody, and he has so many brands that are like always coming to him for business.
He is tremendous. In every story you hear about him giving to people and buying things at Walmart and all these for families and cars, and what he did for Mark Mattson when the Mad Dog, right? When he was a Laker, he bought him a suit and all these other, the stories are endless. I love Shaq.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Jeez. Okay. Last one. Describe yourself as a leader in one sentence.
I'm a person who relates with others personally so that when something is asked, they want to do it on their own rather than through a means of obligation.
Wow. Several mic drop moments within this conversation. You understand that, right?
I hope so, man. I hope so. Thank you very much. Can I ask one more question on your behalf to me? I have a former student who was great in marketing, who came up with an idea, a business idea, and he asked me if I would invest, and I just so happened to have the means to do so. He opened up a dog bar. It's called Pups Pub. I have to just drop it here, not to just promote Pups Pub, by the way, which I love to do, but just because of the fact that it was one of my former students, and I'm now a minority owner, no pun intended, a minority owner in Pups Pub. He started out in Tampa. Now he has a location. We have locations in Orlando. We officially franchised, and we're opening up our next one in Brandon. Check it out. Follow us on Instagram, Pups Pub. It's an indoor-outdoor bar where you bring your dog, your dog's playing around with other dogs. It's an awesome time. If you're a pet owner, if you're a dog owner, go to Pups Pub if you're in Florida. It's awesome. And Chris, check it out. Follow us on Insta. And once again, just to kind of bring it back full circle, this is a student, former student of mine, who still says he took marketing advice to open it up.
That is a great story. In fact, if I lived in Florida, I'd go. I'd take.
I know you. It drinks to be on me.
Dr. Brown, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. This was a pleasure. If you ever need me back, I'm happy to be back. But this was awesome, man. I love everything you're doing, and I'm so happy to be on.
And we thank Dr. Brown very much for being on the show. I have 3 takeaways from this conversation. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Number 1, back to the beginning, the value of the emotional connection between the professor and the student. And Brandon said, be 2 things, be likable and be relatable. That can apply to anything that you're doing, right? Anyone can connect emotionally if you are relatable, likable, and you're trying to understand the other person, listening to them. It's very reminiscent of the conversation that we had in last week's episode of Keep the Line Moving, episode 94 with Shimmy Miller, the women's basketball coach. She was talking about being transactional versus transformational. and putting in the time to understand people. They will play harder for you. Yes, we have to be transactional once in a while, shoot the free throws, run the lines, turn in the report, whatever the case may be, but looking to connect with people, as Dr. Brown said. Second takeaway, how do you introduce yourself? Pay attention to that. What do you say? That's what lights you up. And as a student, pay attention to that. That could guide you on choosing a profession or a major or something to study, right? Very important. The third takeaway, the Mets. Why did they hire Brandon full-time? As he told us, he didn't make the most sales, but they saw potential. Brandon provided intangibles, right? So they could say, hey, we believe in you. We're going to hire you. Yes, you know what? Other people made more sales, but you made the most sales calls. And what did that say about Brandon? Well, enough for him to get that full-time position early in his career. We thank Brandon very much for sharing all these stories as part of his journey. And I thank you for being part of the journey of Keep the Line Moving. Take care, everybody. Have a great week. Every week, you hear guests on this podcast talk about some of their biggest leadership challenges. As a leader, you want to make an impact on those you lead and reach your organization's goals, while also optimizing your time management. Wherever you are in your leadership journey, we could all use some help. This is what we focus on with our group and individual coaching services. To book a call or get more information, email me directly at chrisg@garganoleadership.com or visit our website at garganoleadership.com. For our podcast and video producer, Jack Radutsky, and our marketing coordinator, Savin Narwal, have a great week, everybody.